Welcome to part 7 of the Wyld Whirl Quilt Along. This is our final week. We are adding binding and finishing our quilts. I am so excited. Let's get started. So I previously cut my binding in week 2 when I did my cutting, but I of course forgot to record it. So let's go over how to cut your binding strips. So start by folding your fabric in half very carefully. We want to make sure this is folded perfectly in half and that we're not accidentally folding it a little bit crooked, because then your binding will have little bends in the strips. And a good thing to note is that when you buy fabric from the fabric store, it is not straight when it's folded in half off the bolt. You'll need to press it and fold it again to make sure that it is folded in half correctly. So get it folded in half, and then I'm using my ruler and lining up that horizontal line with the folded edge and making a cut to give me a straight edge to work from. And then I'll pick up this whole slab very gently, rotate it so I can work from the other side using my ruler to make my cuts. I cut my binding to 2¼ inch. You will probably want to do 2½ inch if you're just getting started. It gives you more to work with to wrap around to the back. But if you've done binding before and you don't like how much of a flange there is on the back, give 2¼ inch binding a try. So 2½ inch if you're a beginner, 2¼ inch if you've done binding before and you want to try something different. And if you don't have a big long ruler, you can use a shorter one like this. Just get it lined up as far as you can go, kind of hold your rotary cutter in place, and then finish making that cut. This is where I really like my 6x24 inch ruler. Then I can make one big long cut. Go ahead and cut all of your binding fabric down into strips, and then we will be joining these strips together into one big long strip that's going to wrap all the way around our quilt. I'm going to switch back to the binding that I'm using for the quilt in this video. To join our binding strips, instead of just joining them end to end like this, we're going to join them on the bias, because if we joined them end to end like this, once we folded the binding in half and then wrapped it around the quilt, you end up with a really bulky seam at this one part right here. So instead, what we're going to do is join these strips together on the bias. So this is putting them right sides together and then sewing them from corner to corner. And this creates a bias join. This will distribute that seam across the whole piece instead of just in one place where it's super bulky. And it's not that hard to do. The common mistake I see with this is people sewing from this corner to this corner instead of this corner to this corner. So the way I remember it is I think about what I'm going to cut off after I sew my seam. So if I were to sew that inner angle, I would be cutting my strip off. So just think about what's getting cut off, make sure that is to the right, and then just line your ruler up corner to corner and make a mark with your marking tool. I like to add 2 pins here to hold everything together. And then you can just go ahead and grab the tail of the piece you just added. So that's the piece I added. I'm going to find the end of it, flip that one right sides up, and then flip my next one right side down so they're right sides facing, mark my line, and pin. And now I am ready to sew these all together. And again, I can chain piece here. So I'm starting with my first 2 pieces here, and I'm using that line and just guiding it right down the center line on my machine and sewing those together corner to corner. And then I can just bring in the next set of pieces right behind and stitch those together corner to corner. And here's a closer view. This is how I actually do it. I don't mark and pin anymore. I've just done this enough times that I've gotten pretty good at it. So I just line it up with that first little corner going right to the needle. And then I keep this intersection here lined up on the straight line on my extension table and feed that through, and then just grab the tail and do the next one until they're all sewn together into one big long strip. I like to just use my scissors to cut the excess off and trim these little corners. You can get out your rotary cutter if you prefer, but I find scissors is just a little faster and quicker. So I go that route. And then the next thing we need to do is press. So we are going to press this entire long strip in half, wrong sides together. So I like to use the entire length of my ironing board here and just kind of work my way down, pressing it in half. When you get to the places where you joined the strips, go ahead and press those seams open and then just keep pressing that strip until you have a nice little pile on your floor, and then put it back on the ironing board and tell it, hey, binding, we'll be back for you later. Don't worry. The next thing we need to do is trim our quilt. We need to trim off that excess batting and backing. So to do this, I'm using my ruler and I'm lining up a line on the ruler with a line in the piecing in my quilt. In this case, it's the 2.5-inch line is going along these kind of outside boxes that we have. And I'm just getting that lined up and then making a nice cut. I like to start in the middle and then work my way towards the corners because in my opinion, it's not super important to have the corners square versus keeping a even line that's even with your piecing in the quilt. So I work from the middle to the edge and then I'll turn it. And I'm not worried about getting that square. I'm just worried about getting it straight. It's a quilt. Once we put binding on it and wash it and it shifts and moves, no one's going to know if it's square. So go ahead, get that all trimmed down. And then once we have that trimmed, we will be ready to attach our binding. So go ahead and grab that pile of binding that we made. And I'm going to do something. This is a step I usually skip, but don't skip this step. I'm going to pin it in place. We want to leave a 10-inch tail, and then I'm putting a pin right where I would start sewing. And then I'm just taking a quick minute to kind of run the binding around the edge. What I'm checking for is to make sure that none of those seams end up right on the corner because it can be tricky to get a nice mitered corner if you have a bulky seam there. So I've done that and I've noticed I've made way too much binding. So I'm going to trim off that excess, but making sure that I'm leaving a nice tail to join at the end. So now we are ready to stitch this onto our quilt. I am stitching this on at a 1/4-inch seam allowance. If you have a walking foot or an even feed foot, that's going to make this job a lot easier. And I like to pull up my bobbin thread when I start stitching here. So I'm just kind of working in sections, holding the binding in place. The raw edge of the binding is lined up with the raw edge of the quilt, and I'm stitching that down. This step can be a little tricky because the weight of the quilt is going to be pulling away from you. So just go slow, work in small sections, and make sure the weight of the quilt is up on your table. And then as you come to a corner, slow down. We want to stop stitching a 1/4-inch away from the edge. So you can put a little crease or a little pin there to mark that. And then as I approach, I'm going to slow down and go one stitch at a time and make sure that I land with that needle right at a 1/4-inch away from the edge. So I'm going to stop with the needle down, lift the presser foot, and pivot so that the corner of the quilt is going right through the center of my foot. And then I'm going to finish sewing right off of the corner. What this does is gives us a nice little angle for folding our binding strip in the next step. So I'm going to go ahead and pivot the quilt. So I'm now working onto the next side. And then at this stage, I'm grabbing the binding strip. I'm folding it against that little diagonal that I sewed. So now my binding strip is parallel with the side that I'm attaching it to. I'm giving a nice finger press so I can get a nice sharp corner there. So this is parallel, and then I am folding it back to be in line with that edge. And this leaves like a little kind of triangle flange at the corner here. And just give everything a really good finger press. Make sure it's all lined up nice. And then I like to use a pin here to mark where this stitch line is because we want to start our stitching basically right on the opposite side of that flange from where we left off. So I'm going to start here and then I'm going to back stitch to where the pin is and I'm going to stitch forward. You want to be really careful not to back stitch all the way to the edge. That will pin down this little flange and make it hard for us to get a nice mitered corner. So I'm starting here. I'm going to pull up my bobbin thread and then I'm going to slowly back stitch right to the 1/4-inch away from the edge. So my needle will be in line with my previous stitch line. So I'm holding in my reverse and I'm going slow, just one stitch at a time, right to where that previous stitch line was. So I'm going slow and then I'm taking out my pin and then I go one more stitch back and then I can continue stitching forward and stitching my binding on. And again, be really careful not to go all the way back to the edge. If you do, it's not the end of the world. It's just a little harder to get your corner to fold nice and flat from the other side. So as I mentioned earlier, make sure the weight of the quilt is up on the table and it's not pulling the binding away from you. Use an even feed, walking foot. There's a lot of layers here, so it'll kind of try to spit out the side of your foot. So you kind of have to use a little bit of pressure to keep everything in line as it's going through the machine. So continue sewing your binding on until you get back to where you started. And we want to leave about a 10-inch gap between where we started and where we're going to stop. I just eyeball this. It doesn't have to be exact, but leave a nice little gap. I throw in a couple of back stitches and then cut my thread. Now we need to join these two tails, and we want to do our same little bias join that we did before. This is the easiest way I've seen to do it. I'm grabbing my binding and I'm cutting a little scrap piece. And then what I want to happen is I want these two strips to overlap the exact width of my binding strip. So I'm taking this first one and laying it across. I'm noticing it's a little bit longer, so I'm just trimming it so that it will lay nice and flat when I go to fold the next piece over. So I'm laying this flat, and then I'm taking my binding piece. I'm going to open it up and lay it flat right on the center. And I want to lay it in the center of where I started and stopped stitching, not necessarily the center of this tail. So it is the center of where my gap is. And then I'm folding the other piece over. So now it is sandwiched in between my two binding tails. And this is basically, I'm using that scrap piece of binding as a measuring tool to get my binding pieces to overlap, because I want them to overlap. You want to be careful not to cut at these edges. You want to come and cut on the far edges. So I'm coming across to the far edge and I am cutting this top tail on the left side of the scrap piece of binding. So I'll trim that, and then I will carefully pull that tail back, and then I'm going to trim the bottom piece on the right side of the scrap. So just remember that you want them to be overlapping the exact width of your binding. So we've got those trimmed, they overlap the exact width of our binding, and now we're ready to join them together. And the way I've always remembered this is if you look at them like two little people just going in for a kiss. They both kind of lean in and come in for a little kiss. I don't know why it helps me remember. And then we're just lining these up. So I'm lining up the top corner here, and I'm lining up this edge, and I'll put a couple pins in here to hold this in place for me. And then I am just stitching corner to corner again like we were doing before. This can be a little weird with all of the bulk of the quilt, so just do your best to get everything nice and flat and sew a straight seam across. Before you cut anything, check to make sure you got it right. This looks good. So I'm going to go ahead, snip off that leader and trim the excess from my binding. And then you could go back to the ironing board. I like to just do a quick finger press here to press that seam open, fold it back in half, and then I'm going to finish stitching down the binding to my quilt. So when you get done stitching, throw in a couple back stitches, and now we are ready to press this towards the back. This is just going to help the binding get going in the direction that we need, and will give us a little bit more leverage as we pull it around to the back. So I've got this all pressed from the front. I'm flipping it around to the back, and then I'm using my favorite sewing notion, Elmer's glue, to tack the binding in place, and then I'll go back and stitch in the ditch from the front. And you have a lot of options with binding. You don't have to do it this way. You can hand finish your binding and sew it down. You can sew it to the back and wrap it around to the front. This is the method that I, through 10 years of trial and error now, have come to as my favorite method for binding. I will mention it took a long time for me to get my binding looking good. I think binding is one of the most finicky parts of this step. So cut yourself some slack. This is a spot where when I was sewing on the binding, I got a little too close to the edge. So I just went back and corrected. So if you're getting too close to the edge, you can go back and stitch down, like right here is a little too close, but we're going to roll with it. This is also a good time to grab a label if you want to add a label to your quilt, which I highly recommend labeling your quilts, especially if you're gifting them. I picked this little quality shit label from Kylie and the Machine. I love these labels. I put them on so many things that I make. But again, just using my glue to get that tacked into place. And then I also decided to stitch a little label. I made this for my cat. I like to put the month and the year that I made it. And then the heart T is love tea. So again, just using the glue to get that tacked into place. And then when it comes to the corners, just pull it flat like this and then give that first corner a really good press. And then you can use, if you have a point like this or a pin, to kind of anchor and then pull that corner over. And look at that corner. That is a nice mitered corner. I'm real happy with that. So go ahead and finish gluing and tacking your binding in place. And then our last step here is a stitch in the ditch to tack the binding down. So I'm pulling up that bobbin thread, and then I am again just carefully feeding that center seam line into my machine. I'm turning the speed down. I'm going really slow to carefully line up the edge of that binding down the center of your foot. I like using a clear foot here so I can see what's going on, but we're just going nice and slow. I'm working in small sections, making sure the weight of the quilt is on the table and it's not pulling. And I'm just going to stitch in the ditch all the way around. When you get to the corner, drop the needle, lift your foot, pivot the quilt, and then continue stitching. Here is another view. So you can see my right hand isn't really moving. It acts almost like a jig to kind of hold the edge of the quilt in place as it feeds into the machine. But I am like, I'm dialed in. I'm focused here. This is intense stuff. But go ahead, do your stitch in the ditch all the way around, run over your stitches from where you started. And then look, you're done with your quilt. And oh my God, this is where I realized that my machine was not threaded correctly for that entire stitch in the ditch that I just did. Oh, always on the last seam. It's always the last thing you're doing that your machine is like, nope, JK, we're not done. So you can see here, my machine was not threaded. My stitches are not situated in my quilt. So I get to seam rip this whole thing out. Luckily, because it wasn't properly threaded, this was really easy to pull out and seam rip. My dog was no help, but he looked very cute while he was napping, so I threw that in there. So we get to do another round of stitch in the ditch, which just means I get to practice more. That's all. And there we go. I nailed it that time. Got the binding on, and then I like to do a quick check all the way around to make sure I caught that binding. You can see how close my stitch line is to the edge, and that's where you may want 2.5-inch binding so you have a little bit more room. But I just think it looks a little bit more neat and tidy that way. I did manage to catch everything on the back. If for some reason you're struggling to catch everything when you're stitching binding this way, an option you have is actually to use a decorative stitch on your machine, like I did on this quilt. And this makes sure that you'll catch that binding all the way on the back. You won't run the risk of missing a spot. This does take 10 million years, though, I will warn you. But this is a fun way to add a little bit more flair to your quilt and make sure you catch the binding all the way around. You can also hand tack any spots that you miss. But here we go. We did it. Our quilt is done. I love it. And for me personally, a quilt isn't truly done until it's been washed. So let's go ahead, throw this guy in the wash, and there we go. There's that crinkle I love. I'm obsessed with. Oh my God, it's so good. I love this quilt so much. I'm so happy with how it turned out. The added quilting was definitely the right choice. I'm so glad I went back in and added that. And something I want to point out here, washing erases everything, because if you get in here close, you can see there's some spots where my stitching isn't in line. I've got wobbly lines. I've got points that don't match. But when you stand back, it doesn't really matter. I had a customer tell me one time, if you can't see a mistake 20 feet while riding a horse, then it doesn't exist. And you know, that's just something I think I want to live my life by. So I'm going to. And here's the back. Look at all that delicious texture. Oh my God, it's so good. I had so much fun making this quilt. I hope you enjoyed following this series. If you make this quilt, please tag us on socials. We would love to see it. Here is the finished quilt with its recipient, Stella, my cat. She immediately took a nap on it, so I think she approves. Thank you so much for joining us and following along. I hope you had fun.